Hey monster fans, welcome back to another video. Last time we covered the horror films of the 1920s and its connection to the decade. In this video we're going to be taking a look at the 1930s and explore the horror films that came about from the financial and wartime fears of the people that made them. 1931 gave us many classic horror films, but the one that started it all was Todd Browning's Dracula, which was released on February 12th of that year. The film had already been made without the permission to use the book rights from Stoker's estate in 1922's Nosferatu. Carl Laemmle Jr., however, was interested in the potential for a Dracula film and legally acquired the novel's film rights. Although he had played the role on stage with glowing reviews, Laemmle was not interested in Bela Lugosi to play the role of Dracula for the film. Lugosi had to lobby hard for the role and ultimately won the execs over, which also came from him taking a pay cut to play the role. The role would cement Lugosi not just as a horror icon but a pioneer in film. The film also starred Helen Chandler as Mina Harker, Edward Van Sloan as Van Helsing, Dwight Frye as Renfield, and David Manners as Jonathan Harker. The cast overall is top tier, and although the film is shot like you are watching a theatrical play, the actors are really the main attraction here. Dwight Frye is particularly notable, portraying one of the creepiest yet comedic characters in horror cinema. The film was an early talkie film, given that the sound films had only been around for about 2 years. It also does not include a score, which gives the film a quiet eeriness. Dracula was a huge gamble for Universal, but it ultimately paid off and opened to mostly great reviews among critics. It is worth noting that a Spanish language version of Dracula was also released in 1931. It was directed by George Melford and starred Carlos Villalobos as Dracula and Lupita Tovar as Eva Suard, and Pablo Alvarez Rubio as Renfield. On a technical level, the film is superior to the English version, and even is more risque and less censored. The one missing element from the film is Lugosi's amazing portrayal as Dracula. 1931, in the midst of all the Great Depression, and many suffered from financial issues. For this film represented the draining nature of the Depression, and how it sucked the life source out of the economy. Dracula, being dressed up as an aristocratic figure, may even be seen as the rich preying upon the poor within this difficult time. Fresh off the success of Dracula, Universal put Frankenstein into production. The film was released in November of 1931 and was directed by James Whale. It contains an all-star cast featuring Boris Karloff as the monster, Colin Clive as Henry Frankenstein, Mae Clarke as Elizabeth, and Dracula alumni of Edward Van Sloan as Dr. Waldman, and Dwight Frye as Fritz. Lugosi was set to originally star as the monster. Apparently a series of terrible makeup tests led the Dracula star to leave the project, a decision that many believe changed the course of his career. Karloff would eventually come into the project and cement the Frankenstein monster in pop culture history. The film was adapted from a 1927 play adaptation of Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. Most of the iconic scenes and designs that were associated with the Frankenstein story came from this film. Things like the hunchback assistant, the monster's look, and the line, "It's alive." The film was censored upon its original release, excluding the scene where the monster throws little Maria into the lake and the line, "In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God." The line and the scene, however, have been restored on more recent DVDs and Blu-ray releases. Upon its release, Frankenstein was met with outstanding reviews from critics, and for being released during the Great Depression, the film was still a commercial success. Director James Whale was a war veteran, and the film may have been a way for him to work through the horrors he witnessed during the war. The film contains many surgically accurate tools thrown about, and the monster on the slab looks eerily similar to images of soldiers who were on the operating table after losing limbs. Frankenstein, much like Dracula, also addresses the Great Depression. The monster could have been seen wearing very nice clothes, but instead they chose a style that had a resemblance to many of the laborers during this time who were abandoned by their workplace. Released on December 31st, 1931 in New York City, Rubin Malbin's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde continued right behind Frankenstein and Dracula in paving the way for horror cinema. And like those films, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde met with great reviews. The film was adapted from Robert Louis Stevenson's classic novella and starred Frederick March as the title character. March's performance even earned him his first Academy Award. The film plays into classic themes of the beast within that is inherent in man. It explores what could really be lying within the human soul. Most of his prey are women, which represents the repressed sexual urges of quote-unquote civilized men. And much like in Dracula, Hyde is dressed up in very high-class clothing, and like Dracula, he preys on the lower class, which again brings in fears that had been going around during this Great Depression era. In August of 1932, Dr. X would be released in the US. The film follows a reporter who is investigating a string of murders that have all taken place at the night under full moon. The victims' bodies have all been cannibalized after the murders, with witnesses describing a horribly disfigured monster as the perpetrator. The film stars Universal Monster regular Lionel Atwell as Dr. X, Fay Wray as Joan Xavier, and Lee Tracy as the Daily World reporter Lee Taylor. Warner Brothers made the film using a early 2-color Technicolor process, with black and white prints shipped to small towns and to foreign markets, and the color prints of the film were only shown in major cities. The film was a pre-Code era production and covered themes such as murder, rape, cannibalism, and prostitution. The film was well received by critics and did well at the box office, so much so that Warner Brothers continued to produce horror films in the years to come.
We accept a one of us. We accept a one of us. Gooba gobble, gooba gobble. We accept her, we accept her. Gooba gobble, gooba gobble. One of us, one of us.
Released in February 12th of 1932, Freaks is considered by some not to be a horror film. However, many do look at it for its horror sequences. The film was directed by Dracula director Todd Browning, and it follows a trapeze artist who joins a group of carnival sideshow performers with a plan to seduce and murder one of the performers to gain his inheritance. But her plot has dangerous consequences. The film is based on parts from a short story called Spurs by Todd Robbins. Freaks was test screened in January of 1932 and was met with disgust, and many found it too grotesque. The film was also banned in the UK for almost 30 years. Although it received backlash and wasn't a box office hit when it initially released, many took another look at the film in the 1960s, especially in Europe, with many critics suggesting that the film paints a sympathetic portrait of its sideshow characters rather than an exploitative one. However, this is still debated today. Many believe that the film is a metaphor for class conflict as a result of the Great Depression.
You're convinced that the thing on this table isn't human?
Its cries are human.
Do you know what it is, what I began with?
Also released in the winter of 1932 was H.G. Wells' based The Islands of Lost Souls, which was directed by Earl C. Kenton and produced by Paramount Pictures. Both the source material, The Island of Dr. Moreau, and this film share the same plot, of an obsessed scientist who conducts surgical experiments on animals. The film starred Charles Laughton, Richard Aryan, Layla Hames, and Bela Lugosi. It was censored and or banned all over the US and UK. The promise of progress given to the animals by their master in the film was just a dirty trick. They then revolt against Moreau. This plot point could be seen as a depressionary anxiety of the working class being exploited and rising up against the upper class. Having been a huge success for Universal, Karloff was brought onto their next horror film, The Mummy, which was released on December 22nd in 1932. The film was directed by Karl Freund and stars Zita Johann as Helen, David Manners as Frank, and Edward Van Sloan returning for a third time to Universal Horror Picture as Dr. Mueller. Many in the 30s had a fascination with Egypt and the pyramids. The head of Universal, Carl Laemmle, was no different, and he wanted to do a mummy movie after the opening of King Tut's tomb in 1922. Laemmle searched for a literary text to adapt. However, there wasn't one, unlike previous Universal horror films that were based off of books. The film was a success at the box office, especially in the United Kingdom, Although the film has some similar story beats to Dracula, it has an amazing performance by Boris Karloff and a spectacular mummy makeup by the great Jack Pierce, who worked on Karloff in Frankenstein. Murders in the Rue Morgue is a Universal-produced horror film based on the Poe short story of the same name. The film stars Lugosi 1 year after he portrayed Dracula. He plays a lunatic scientist who abducts women and injects them with the blood of an ape. The film was made as a compensation for Lugosi and director Robert Forley, who were both dropped from the Frankenstein picture. Upon its initial release, the film was faced with harsh reviews. After a poor performance, Lugosi's Universal contract was cancelled. The idea of mixing human and ape DNA could have been inspired by the Scopes trials of 1925, which involved debates over teaching evolution in state schools.
You're blaspheming.
On the contrary, my dear Rebecca, I was merely telling your wondering guests that you were about to thank your gods for their bounty.
That'll do. I know your mocking, lying tongue.
To thank them for the health and prosperity.
The Old Dark House is a horror comedy film directed by James Whale of Frankenstein fame. The film follows 5 travelers who seek shelter in a creepy estate. It stars Boris Karloff, Melvyn Douglas, Gloria Stewart, and Charles Laughton. The film was part of many productions made to capitalize on Karloff's recent success with Frankenstein. The film received great reviews and is considered one of James Whale's best films as it combines horror and his dark sense of humor. Vampire is a German horror film that follows a drifter who has an obsession with the supernatural. He stumbles upon an inn where a critically ill young girl is slowly becoming a vampire. The film was directed by Danish director Carl Theodor Dreyer, who had just come off of the silent classic The Passion of Joan of Arc. The film opened to negative reviews all over Europe, but more recently it is praised for its visual effects, striking images, and dreamlike tone, once you get past the slow pace of the film. Vampire has been released on home video in many cut forms. The original film negative is sadly lost.
The sinister power behind the white zombie.
After Murders in the Rue Morgue, Lugosi would star in White Zombie, directed by Victor Halpern. The film was based on The Magic Island by William Seabrook, which focuses on a young woman's transformation into a zombie at the hands of an evil voodoo master. White Zombie reinforced an idea many had for Americans' occupation of Haiti, and the film comes off as a subtle propaganda film for this idea, especially with the American being the protagonist of the film. Race is also a huge aspect of the film, as the voodoo master tries to zombify a white female in cause of urgency, which causes the urgency of the film compared to all the black natives that have been turned into zombies, and not much thought is put into that. Through the film, the zombies are used as mindless employees, which created a horror around the monotony of work. In 1932, many feared losing their jobs, and this movie decided to present work as the horrific entity. In May of 1933, the Mexican supernatural horror film La Llorona was released. The film was directed by Ramon Peñón and starred Ramon Berida. It was based off of the legend of La Llorona, a woman who killed her children and then who kills herself and is trapped between life and death, crying out for her children. It was the first Mexican horror film and was one of 21 sound films made in Mexico in the year 1933.
Crazy to know who I am, aren't you? All right, I'll show you. There's a souvenir for you. I'll show you who I am.
1933 gave the world 2 huge special effects pioneering films. One was King Kong, and the other was The Invisible Man, another James Whale directed horror film produced by Universal. The film plays more into James Whale's comedic side than its previous films, and has a fantastic cast such as Claude Rains, William Harrigan, Una O'Connor, and Gloria Stewart. The film was originally set to star Boris Karloff, however he dropped out after his salary was cut. Rains was a perfect choice to play the role, and his iconic voice was able to transcend the fact that he was never shown on screen. The film was big at the box office and was Universal's most successful horror film since Frankenstein, and it's one of my personal favorites from this decade. After having success with Dr. X, Warner Brothers made Mystery of the Wax Museum, which was directed by Michael Curtiz and used a similar two-color Technicolor process to that of Dr. X. The film centers around a reporter investigating the disappearance of people, which leads him to a wax museum and an evil sculptor. The film stars Lionel Atwill, who had just starred in Dr. X, Fay Wray, another Dr. X alumni, and Frank McHugh. The film was important for laying down the groundwork to inspire a 1953 remake starring Vincent Price, with the remake focusing more on the horror elements rather than the mystery.
And well, you will find her almost as beautiful as when you last saw her. She died.
In May of 1934, Universal Pictures would have its biggest hit of the year with The Black Cat, a film that brought together two icons of horror, Karloff and Lugosi. It follows American honeymooners in Hungary who become trapped in the house of a Satan-worshipping priest. Although Poe's name is listed in the credits, it has little to do with the 1843 short story of the same name. The film was directed by Edgar G. Ulmer, and it helped create and popularize the psychological horror subgenre. It did this with its great atmosphere, creepy sound, and exploring the dark side of the human psyche.
Drink! Drink! Good!
April of 1935 saw the release of the sequel to Frankenstein, The Bride of Frankenstein, considered by many to be one of the best sequels ever made and superior to the original, but that debate is a video on its own. James Whale returned to the directing chair and Boris Karloff returned to play his most iconic role. The film focuses on the monster looking for a friend and acceptance, but doesn't seem to have much luck. The stunning Elsa Lanchester would appear in the film as Mary Shelley in the film's intro, and later as the bride, in only the last few minutes of the film. The Bride of Frankenstein is a well-written, well-directed masterpiece and contains many themes throughout the film. Dr. Pretorius makes his debut in this film as Henry Frankenstein's former mentor. In the film, he is trying to desperately get Frankenstein to create a new being with him. Some has read into this and Frankenstein's neglect for his wife as an underlying gay message as two men seek to create life without sex. James Whale has many of these themes floating around the film and in the first film, as he himself was openly gay, which was a big thing in the 1930s. Many religious elements can also be found throughout the film. In one scene, the monster is tied up onto a log, and for a single shot is risen up upon it looking much like the crucifix. In one classic scene where the monster befriends a blind man, the monster has somewhat of a Last Supper, which consists of bread and wine. Bride of Frankenstein is one of the greats of early cinema, and especially in this film, people can relate with the monster as someone who is searching for belonging and acceptance. Nearly a week after the release of Bride of Frankenstein, Mark of the Vampire was released by MGM. The film was directed by Dracula and Freaks director Todd Browning. The film stars Bela Lugosi, Lionel Barrymore, Elizabeth Allen, and Lionel Atwill. Many describe the film as the sound version of Todd Browning's now lost silent film, London After Midnight. The story centers on a mysterious murder of a nobleman. A local doctor determines that he was killed by a vampire. However, this is dismissed by the police. A year after his death, the nobleman's daughter is attacked and has bite marks found around her throat. Many then start to believe vampires are about, but not is all what it seems.
Mr. Glendon, the werewolf instinctively seeks to kill the thing it loves best.
What is now the earliest surviving werewolf movie, Werewolf of London, was released in May of 1935. It was directed by Stuart Walker and produced by Universal. While on a botanical expedition in Tibet, Wilfred Glendon is attacked by a werewolf. Upon his return to London, he transforms into a killer beast during the night. with his only hope for a cure being a rare flower. The film stars Henry Hull, Warren Oldland, Valerie Hobson, and Lester Matthews. Makeup master Jack Pierce, who 6 years later would work on the 1941 classic The Wolfman, did his first werewolf makeup on Henry Hull. The original design for the film resembled the makeup of Lon Chaney Jr., but ultimately it was rejected in favor for a more subtle approach. The werewolf's howl heard in the film is actually a blend of Hull's vocals and a recording of an actual timber wolf. Although the film was not a success upon its release and was ultimately compared to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde films, the film still laid a groundwork for the werewolf in horror cinema and paved the way for Chaney's version.
Put it back.
Mad Love is the film adaptation of the novel The Hands of Orlok. It was directed by German filmmaker Karl Freund and stars Peter Lorre, Francis Drake, and Colin Clive. The film follows a demented surgeon's obsession with an actress that leads him to secretly replace her husband's mangled hands with the hands of a murderer with a skill of throwing knives. This was Freund's final directorial project, and it was Peter Lorre's American film debut. Not long before the film was released, MGM announced the film title would be The Hands of Orlok, but eventually it was changed to Mad Love. Many of the positive reviews of the film were centered on Lorre's performance, and it made him an icon for American horror.
Thunder, look at me. What do you see in my eyes?
Death.
May 11th of 1936 would introduce the world to Dracula's Daughter, the sequel to 1931's Dracula. Dracula's Daughter was directed by Lambert Hillier and stars Gloria Holden, Otto Kruger, and Irving Pitchell. Edward Van Sloan returns as Professor Van Helsing, and Universal didn't have the rights for the source material which the film was based on, the short story called Dracula's Guest. MGM acquired the rights, but later Universal bought the rights from them in 1934, but they had to begin production on the film based on it by February of 1936. Gloria Holden gives a fantastic performance as the tragic Countess Zaleska, burdened by her curse to be one of the undead. She seeks to have a normal life. For being released in 1936, it was worthy to note that the film has a lesbian undertone, including a scene where the Countess compliments a young girl who is her model right before Zaleska goes in to presumably bite her on the neck. Rules were in place by Universal when shooting the scene that didn't allow for more explicit implications. The film was released to mixed reviews. I think that it's a wonderful sequel with great performances, even if Lugosi does not make a return.
This is the nebula in Andromeda. A ray from this nebula will be caught here and electrically transferred to the projector in my laboratory.
On January 20th of 1936, Universal released The Invisible Ray, a science fiction horror film directed by Dracula's Daughter director Lambert Hillier. It follows a scientist who locates an unusual meteorite. Upon examining it, he is exposed to an unknown element, Radium X. This makes him glow and has his touch become deadly, and is slowly driven mad by it. The film was another Karloff and Lugosi mashup film, and it also starred Francis Drake and Frank Lawton. The film contains a mostly original score, but includes cues from The Bride of Frankenstein. Reviews for the film were mostly positive, and although many modern reviews mention its datedness, it is still looked at as a fun and positive horror experience.
They die dead. I die live. What? That'll be all he got.
In September of 1939, the third in the Frankenstein series was released, Son of Frankenstein. It was directed by Roland V. Lee, and it was the last of the Frankenstein films to have Boris Karloff in the monster role. In 1938, Universal did a re-release of both Dracula and Frankenstein as a double feature. They are once again a success and proved to Universal that audiences were still hungry for horror. The film centers on Wolf Frankenstein, Henry Frankenstein's son, who relocates his family to his family's castle. However, they encounter hostility from the villagers due to the past terrors. Murder starts up again, and the villagers begin to suspect Wolf. as the culprit. Lugosi gives one of his greatest performances as the evil Igor. In this film, the monster no longer speaks and takes a backseat to Wolf and Igor. Even Lionel Atwell as an Inspector Krogh has a bigger role. Although the monster isn't his essential character, the battle of the wits between Wolf, Igor, and Krogh are what makes the film, in my opinion, worthy of the series. The film was highly successful and helped return Universal Studios to profitability. Unfortunately, later that year, war struck out in Europe and the world would never be the same. The 1930s were a booming time for horror cinema. We were exploring themes of morality within our culture, and American horror would put the fear of the Great Depression onto the silver screen. As the 30s carried on, we saw more sequels and films trying to replicate the success of previous box office hits. In the late 30s, more scientific horror films were released, and in some ways that would foretell the horrors of World War II. The world was going to have much more to fear than the monsters on the screen. Thanks for tuning in to another video. If you like this video, make sure to hit that thumbs up button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what your favorite 1930s horror film is, and I'll catch you in the next one.